Unity Online Radio, the voice of an awakening world.
We are pleased to bring you this special series on Unity Online Radio. To learn about other series, go to unityonlineradio.org and click on Special Series.
Welcome to a special series, The Three Faces of God, with co-hosts Karen Kelly and Reverend Ellen Davenport, author of The Five Principles. They'll be exploring the different aspects of the divine that show up in world religions and in unity. No matter what you think about God now, stay tuned for new ideas on The Three Faces of God.
Welcome to the sixth and final show of our series, The Three Faces of God. I'm here with my co-host, Karen Kelly. How are you? I heard there was a monsoon this morning in Chicago.
Yes, there was. People are going to work in boats rather than cars.
Can you believe this? The 6 weeks is already over? And, you know, the announcer just now has been promising people for 6 weeks that we were going to talk about the three faces of God in world religions. And today we're actually doing that. So just to recap, as you know, in this show we've been focusing on what the American philosopher Ken Wilber describes as the three faces of God, which are basically God within, God in relationship, and God as all that is. If you've missed any of our shows, we've talked to several interesting people about this. The shows have been recorded. They are here on Unity Online Radio under a little tab called Special Series. So Three Faces of God, you can listen online, you can download them and take them on a walk or a treadmill, whatever you're doing. So Karen, I know you're especially excited about our guest today.
I really am. As you know, when we put together our schedule for the Three Faces of God, one of our goals was to include one show about how the great world religious traditions approach the experience of the divine and how they may understand the three faces of God in their experience. Well, as you know, Ellen, that proved to be a very lofty goal. It was trickier than I had ever imagined to find someone who knows a lot about what each of the tradition's historical views have been, and yet are also up to date about the changes and movements within the great religions. And then when you add on the perspective of wanting to know about the three faces of God and Wilber's integral spirituality, well, it's almost impossible. But we found him. So Dustin DePerna is joining us today from beautiful San Francisco. Hi, Dustin.
Hi, Karen. Hi, Ellen. Great to be with you both.
Oh, we are so excited for you to be here. So if I could, just let me take a minute to tell our listeners a little bit about you, Dustin. So for the past decade, Dustin has been a dedicated student of American philosopher Ken Wilber's integral theory and his integral spirituality that we're a little bit familiar with. He currently studies under the direct mentorship of Ken Wilber, and he's worked with Ken Wilber's Integral Institute in the Integral Spiritual Center in Boulder, Colorado, before turning to writing full-time. Now, as an author, Dustin has over 1,200 pages that are going to be published and coming out very shortly. And I think, as a matter of fact, Ken Wilber writes the foreword to your books. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's correct.
And Dustin is also the founder of the Foundation for Integral Religion and Spirituality. He's committed his life's work to the development of integrally informed spiritual paths that make spiritual awakening accessible to everyone. And before all this happened, he earned his Bachelor's of Science from Cornell University, his Master of Liberal Arts and Religion from Harvard University. And life is good because he lives in beautiful Northern California with his wife Amanda and his daughter Jaya. He has lots to tell us about how the great world religion traditions approach the experience of the divine and even how the three faces of God show up in them. So you've been busy with so many projects, Dustin. Can you tell us a little bit about your upcoming books and your new foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you again to you both for having me on the show. And it's always great to be back in touch with the Unity community. Kelly Isola invited me to speak on a show on the spiral of development, how that shows up in the traditions a few years ago. So just great to be back with everybody again. So I've been really busy, as you can tell, over the past few years. I mean, 1,200 pages is sort of a... some of those pages are co-authored. One of the book is co-authored and one book is an anthology, but at least 800 pages are my own writing. So it's been a really massive, it's like 2 PhD theses all in one. So I've really been passionate over the past few years about how can religion serve as a positive force for social action in society? Because in many ways, we see that more traditional or fundamental forms of religion are actually creating blockades of sorts to deeper connectivity and human progress in certain areas. And so I really wanted to look at religion as an evolutionary catalyst as opposed to a blockade. And it took me down an incredible path of meeting spiritual teachers and leaders from every tradition. It took me all around the globe. And what I've come to is a sort of synthesis in these books that brings all of my insight and information that I've gained through studying with Wilber, all of the insight and information from being with these teachers, and then my own direct practice and experience sort of culminates in these books. And the idea is that the books have an opportunity to be used both academically and socially among people who are interested in this sort of thing. And soon after writing these books, we realized that we needed to develop a foundation that would be able to harness and organize some of the energy coming out around both the books and integral spirituality in general. And so I, along with dear friends Lisa Salentino and Bruce Alderman, we founded this Foundation for Integral Religion and Spirituality. So I'm happy to speak about any of that further, but it's just been a wild ride over the past 5 or 6 years. And to be here now with you feels like just an exciting birth and emergence of making some of this stuff more public.
Well, we're going to want to be following you very closely, and when your book comes out officially, you want to let us know, and we'll let our listeners know how to get that. And I'm feeling like we have to have a whole series just around your book. That's just me talking. I'm just saying I'm digging in. You know already, Dustin, I get pretty enthusiastic about this stuff. And we have to just tell our listeners one more thing, that on top of all of these things we've mentioned, we understand that you're heading off tomorrow to Switzerland for the whole summer to do some very special work that you can give us a little bit of an insight into.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So this summer, I'm working with a really interesting group. We're an international group, but based out of Switzerland. And we've been looking at the ways in which high levels of spiritual intelligence inform decision-making, and the ways in which if we bring leaders together from various industries, say economics, politics, education, who all have a very high level of spiritual intelligence, how does that affect the remaking and rebooting of the global systems? So it's really a dream come true. I mean, I've been thinking for a long time that eventually we will have a group of deeply awake, present, caring beings helping to direct our planet. And it seems like some of that is beginning to emerge slowly but surely. So I'm thrilled, spending the summer with a group of amazing folks.
And so a lot of people in Unity know Cindy Wigglesworth, and you're basing this on her work, spiritual intelligence work?
Yes, some of it definitely incorporates Cindy's work. Cindy and I are very close. She's been just an incredible mentor for me over the past few years, and was actually very supportive in both emotionally and financially in the publication of this first book. So I owe her a lot of gratitude and just positive energy back. But I'm trained in Cindy's model. Cindy has a spiritual intelligence model that assesses 21 skills of spiritual intelligence. And I've done coaching training with her, and I've coached several people through her assessment. So anybody interested in spiritual intelligence in particular, Cindy's work at deepchange.com is really fantastic.
It's really interesting. I had that training too a few years ago, and Kelly Isola has had it, and a number of people in Unity. It's, there's Unity people tend to resist being labeled. And so there's been a little resistance to, is one person more spiritually intelligent than another? Yeah. It seems to me fairly obvious that yes, some of them are. So I'm curious how you are assembling spiritually intelligent people in Switzerland? How do you even figure out who they are?
Well, the starting point for all of this is always just building relationships. And I think there's really no need for labeling and assessing and this sort of thing. That really just opens a conversation, as I think Cindy would agree. That sort of assessment opens a dialogue and a conversation about these sort of things. But folks who are already deeply embedded in spiritual communities and have a lot of spiritual practice or spiritual realization in their own life and experience, the need for assessing like that isn't necessary. But what we do find is that people with high levels of spiritual intelligence naturally are drawn towards collaboration. And I think that's one of the interesting things that we can notice about those with higher spiritual intelligence versus those with less. Those with less tend to be more bound within their own egos and want things for themselves and want to kind of isolate quite a bit. Whereas those with a higher level of spiritual intelligence understand the interconnectedness of all of reality and with each other, and as a result are more willing to cooperate. So we really started by building relationships with folks. And after those relationships were built on a very heart level and friendship level, we invited people to come together in a form of cooperation for the greater whole that would serve everybody, that would serve not just a country or a political interest, but that would serve the whole planet. And that's really the lure, is can you step out of your own ego into service to the whole? And that naturally weeds out those who are spiritually intelligent and those who are not.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So we're going to have spiritually intelligent people in politics and economics and carefully placed all over the world? Is that the plan?
Well, you know, what's really interesting is that people are already placed. And that what hasn't happened yet is that they haven't all coordinated with each other. We find all over the globe, nothing actually needs to necessarily change, that the whole system is already abundant and full of all of these super highly spiritually intelligent people. But up until the past decade or so, the capacity for the connectivity that the internet has allowed and that, you know, international travel has allowed, we now have the opportunity for these people to meet each other, to coordinate efforts, and to actually emerge and stand up all at once. So it's been sort of a secret bubbling that's been happening over the years, and all of a sudden we have the opportunity to make things a little bit more public. And maybe I give a caveat, too, that the timing of it is really going to be interesting. It's either going to happen, you know, very quickly, or it's going to happen in some time. And I think either way, it'll be coordinated, and there will be an emergence of I sometimes call it an army of good, you know, an army of good on the planet. It really, it's like
this
each
is
of us.
So encouraging.
It is like encouraging. I think we need to get you on Fox News and see how a conversation would go there.
I would love to be on Fox News and have a chat with those folks. Absolutely.
Oh, that's amazing. It's amazing.
Well, because one of the great things, if I just make one comment about that, one of the great things about an integral perspective, or this more comprehensive and integrative viewpoint, is that, you know, everybody's right. But what we acknowledge is that some people are more right than others, and everybody's also partially right. And so, you know, that means that we can go on to Fox News and we can really honor any perspectives that they're bringing that are true. But then we can also point out where they might be partial and where they could be more comprehensive and full. So going on Fox News would be fantastic. I think there'd be a lot of positive good that came from that.
I'd actually like to see you on with Rachel Maddow personally. I think that would be fantastic.
That would be a good interview.
Oh, my God, on MSNBC. That would be fantastic.
Let's send her an email.
Yes.
Hey, Rachel, have we got a guy for you?
Oh, man. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, well, this is good. I think we can start now in talking a little bit about your exploration and writing about the spiritual awakening and enlightenment that you've been seeing across all the great world traditions, Dustins. And, you know, I think you are focusing mostly on Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity. Is that right?
Yeah, but I should make a caveat there that, you know, intentionally for the purposes of this book that you have a copy of, I had to limit my analysis, or else it could go on forever. So, you know, there's so much to say about the Jewish tradition. There's lots to say about the Sikh tradition or the Baha'i faith, and lots and lots to say. But I had to limit it, and I limited it to the most populous traditions on the planet. So, just to say that, yes, the books that I've written has some limitation to it. But certainly my interests don't stop there. I'm interested in every way that faith shows up in the world and how we can use that for positive social gain.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Well, in our show, we're interested, of course, in trying to pull you in a little bit and focus all your energies on what Wilber calls the three faces of God. And once again, for our audience, they're the God within, the inner God, the I amness, as you refer to it, Dustin, God in relationship, the beloved, the great other, and God as the great web of life or the ground of being, the infinite God, the he, she, it. And I think it's important to mention that Ellen and I, and probably most of our listeners, would like to hear you talk a little bit about the basics of Islam, Buddhism, and Hindi traditions before we get into particulars about the spiritual awakening and enlightenment. So could you tell us, Dustin, what some of the important points are for us to know about each of these traditions?
Sure.
You told us earlier that you can't pigeonhole a world religion with a particular face of God, but that's really exactly what I wish you would do.
Well, maybe I should make that comment first, because I do think it's an important caveat that we should always say from the beginning, and that's that, within any of our world's religious traditions, there's a massive amount of diversity, and there's a massive amount of ways in which each of these faces show up. So we can say that a certain tradition might originate from a particular bias towards a particular face, but we also want to leave the opening that all of these faces show up in various ways. And that's simply because all human beings have the capacity to take perspectives. When we're talking about the three faces of God, we're talking about the capacity to take perspectives and how perspectives change our relationship to reality. So, you exactly as you define three faces of God, I think it's perfectly true and appropriate. But another way is just defining them as first, second, and third person. And these first, second, and third persons are embedded in our language systems. And because of that, they're a very natural and organic way that we can relate to things. So these definitely all show up in traditions. And but, if you want me to pigeonhole, I can make broad, sweeping, generalizing orientations.
That's what I want. That's where I want to start.
And it also gives us a baseline for our listeners to know what reference points and language you're going to be using.
Sure.
And hopefully we'll get any misinformation set to the side so that we can hear your message clearly. And I can't believe it. I think we'll probably have to talk about that after we go to break.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, why don't we take a break? We're about a minute early, but let's take a break now so we can start this conversation in one whole package. Let me see.
But before we do, maybe you can tell our viewers about our Facebook page and stuff, because then we don't have to do it later on.
Yeah, okay.
Just a minute.
Yes, we have a Facebook page, Three Faces of God, where we have a conversation going on about all of these shows. We would still love to hear your questions and comments. Even though this series is ending, we'll still be around. The Facebook page will stay live. Or you can email us directly at thethree-facesofgod@unityonlineradio.org if you're willing to type all of that into the address. So we will be back after these messages from Unity.
You're listening to Unity Online Radio. This programming is made possible through the generous love offerings of listeners like you. If you feel spiritually fed by this programming, we invite you to contribute. Go to www.unity.fm and click on Donate Now.
Hi, this is Ellen Davenport. The Five Principles was my first book, and here's what I've learned as an author. It's nice to sell a lot of books, but it's truly gratifying to know the book is being read, used, and studied in churches and small groups in the U.S. and beyond. And I get a real kick out of hearing that someone gave the Five Principles to friends who aren't in Unity. Because the Five Principles are universal spiritual laws. They operate in everyone's life, whether they know it or not. They've been discovered and rediscovered by spiritual masters for thousands of years. God is all there is. We are expressions of God. We create our experience with the power of our thoughts. We align ourselves with the well-being of the universe through prayer and meditation. And we live the truth we know every day in every decision. Just 5 principles. They cover it all. Buy the book at unity.org.
Music Speaks Louder Than Words is an inspiring, informative, and fun hour of uplifting, heartfelt music and commentary that delivers a powerful message of love, joy, and oneness. It will keep you smiling and singing along. Your hosts, Reverends Dale Worley and Christy Snow, are alive with the Spirit of God and singing their love to you each Thursday afternoon at 3 p.m. Central Time with Music Speaks Louder Than Words. Music. It's the only thing that the whole world listens to.
Music speaks louder than words when you sing.
You're listening to The Three Faces of God, a special series with co-hosts Karen Kelly and Reverend Ellen Davenport. Join the discussion on Facebook and submit questions for upcoming shows. Now, back to The Three Faces of God.
We are back with The Three Faces of God. We're talking to our guest today, Dustin DePerna, who is an author, prolific author, and founder of the Foundation for Integral Religions and Spirituality, and is doing interesting things all over the world. So before we went to break, Dustin was starting to tell us about the basics of some of the world's great religious traditions and how the three faces of God might fit into them. So take it away, Dustin.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. So maybe if I just start with a few broad brushstrokes so that folks who are listening can get just oriented a bit to some of these different traditions.
Okay.
Now, one of the things that we know about American culture and about many cultures in the modern world is that we're very religiously illiterate, meaning that we don't actually know a lot about faiths outside of our own, and sometimes we don't have our own faith, so we don't know very much about faiths in general. So I think a few broad strokes would be helpful. And maybe we start with just some of the very, very basics. And so if we start with Islam, for example, we know that in Islam was, in a sense, we could say founded by Muhammad. And we know that Muhammad lived in something around 600 or so after the death of Christ. And what we know about Islam is that there's at least these 5 pillars that we can explore. And these are 5 pillars of commitment within Islam. And so that first pillar of commitment in Islam is that each Muslim professes a faith in God and as Muhammad as the prophet. So there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. It's the very first pillar of Islam. A second thing that's very important in Islam, the second pillar, is that people take a commitment to prayer, to daily prayer. Normally this prayer happens 5 times throughout the day, but it also can be less than that. More moderate versions don't require that exact amount, but prayer. Prayer is the second pillar, and it's very important. The third is charitable giving, that there is an impulse in Islam to take care of others, to really give, to give part of your income and however that shows up to others. And there's also a fourth pillar around fasting. There's a need to fast at particular points in time, so that fasting as a way to both make a sacrifice and a commitment of faith. And that's fasting during the month of Ramadan. Mm-hmm. And then finally is a pilgrimage, and that's the pilgrimage to Mecca. And that's suggested that that's done at least once in a lifetime. Mm-hmm. And if we speak really generally about Islam, which is always dangerous, but since you guys are really begging me for it, I'm going to do it.
We are.
There's a very strong second face of God in Islam. And that means that there's a very strong commitment to God as great other, the compassionate divine being. And we see that showing up in many different ways. But in its most clear form, we can see it in just the pillars I named. In number 1 and number 2, there's no God but God is clearly an expression that could express a faith of relationship. And the prayer could express an example of prayer to a relationship with God. Now, I don't feel comfortable fully saying that without also saying that there are many branches of Islam, particularly Sufi traditions and other mystic traditions, that are much more oriented towards a first-person face of God.
Right.
And so someone like Ibn Arabi is a perfect example of a beautiful mystic scholar and practitioner who has a term he calls supreme identity, where the first and second pillars of belief and worship really come down to all is God. There's no God but God. And the prayer is a form of more contemplation or surrender into that divinity as a first-person direct experience. So it's always important to acknowledge that both of these are there. And I could say much more about third faith there, but why don't we move on to another faith? So we're just making these broad strokes, if that's okay.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. So Buddhism. Now, many folks here might be familiar with the Dalai Lama, for example. The Dalai Lama is a very popular political figure. The Dalai Lama is the 14th Dalai Lama. What that means is he's the 14th consecutive incarnation of actually the very same being. And most people don't always recognize that or know that. So the Dalai Lama is the head of a particular type of Buddhism called Tibetan Buddhism. And if we speak more generally, as many of you know, Buddhism flourished in India, in China, in Burma, Thailand, all over Southeast Asia, and Japan. And there's a few basic characteristics of Buddhism that we can speak about. And if we speak very generally, we can say that Buddhism has two main tenets. Actually, many, many more than this. 4 Noble Truths and many things. But two tenets. One is that we have the capacity as human beings to be totally free, to be happy, to be liberated from the general suffering that we face day to day of separate existence. So that's possible. And that we also have this responsibility to act compassionately or loving towards each other. And what's interesting about Buddhism is that most of the practices that are done in Buddhism, at least as we've received it in the West, are much more first-person oriented. So that means that they're first faith of God oriented. We have this capacity in ourselves to tap into a deeper awareness, and that awareness or higher self, which actually is no self at all, but is the whole of reality, is actually the space in which we find both liberation and the space in which we find the deepest compassion for others. Now, just like I had to do with Islam, the caveats are needed, that there are many forms of practice within Buddhism that actually have devotional practices to various forms or expressions of gods and goddesses. And so second phase is there. And definitely the contemplation or understanding the web of life is very, very prevalent in Buddhism as well. But if we had to name it as just one, as you guys have asked, first phase is definitely very prevalent in Buddhism.
I didn't know that. I didn't know they had gods and goddesses. I thought there was no deity.
They do. They do, in fact, have many. And sometimes they're seen as expressions of that one single ultimate reality, and sometimes not. And it really also depends on the type of Buddhism we're talking about, because Buddhism as it shows up in Zen in Japan is much different than Buddhism as it shows up in say, Tibet. The Tibetan Buddhism is much more full of a lot of ornate and elaborate mandalas of deities and things like this, whereas Zen is much more clean and crisp, and there isn't a lot of extra bells and whistles, as you say. So again, to stereotype is not possible. So we always have to talk about where are we talking about, what time period, where in the world is this coming up. So if we now let's think about Hinduism. So Hinduism is a great example, and I personally, I've experience with so many of these because I've been such a passionate practitioner. But I spent a period of time in my life really, really convinced that I was a Hindu, and it was really the first tradition that I was exposed to that incorporated a strong first-person expression of the divine. So if we speak about Hinduism in very, very general terms, if we speak specifically about Vedanta, which is a very popular form of Hinduism, we recognize that in Vedanta there's teachings about a higher self, capital S self, or what's sometimes called Atman. And many of you probably have heard of things like the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads. And both the Bhagavad Gita and Upanishads are forms of text. Bhagavad Gita actually an epic a poem or song, and the Upanishads, these deep teachings of wisdom from within the Vedantic tradition or Vedic tradition. And what we find there is this really common phrase, if we wanted to just synthesize it, and that's that Atman equals Brahman, or Atman is Brahman. And what that means, in very layman's terms, is that this deepest self, this capital S self, and Brahman, all of the world or the divine or God, is actually the same. That I amness, this deepest place of I amness within us, and the deepest aspects of reality or the divine are actually non-different. And so the sacred books of the Hindus are very explicit about this first face of God. Mm-hmm. But as many of you know, they also have the second face and third face. So we speak about bhakti yoga. Bhakti yoga is this devotional form of practice or devotional form of union. And in that devotional form of practice, second face of God is most prevalent. There's much devotion. And yes, it's often understood that all forms of deity or all forms of gods and goddesses are expressions of that single reality, but simultaneously there's still a deep devotional aspect, which is a second face of God. Similarly, the connection to the web of life, or the understanding of sort of the interconnectedness of all of reality in a third person or more contemplative way, is certainly fully there in the Hindu tradition as well. Wow.
And I would be interested in your observation about Christianity too, because I know that is one that you're, and that's you might have some surprising things to say about the Christian tradition and the various ways that it's showing up today within even the United States, let alone the world.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. Well, we certainly see in the United States within evangelical movements a massive revitalization of a direct personal relationship, second-person relationship with the divine. And that's often combined with state experiences, with experience of ecstasy or of massive healing or pure devotion or gratitude. And there's a strong revival of an experiential second-person relationship we certainly see happening within evangelical movements in the United States. We also see other forms of progressive Christianity really turning towards either a more contemplative version of spirituality or of the divine. We see this in Father Thomas Keating, who many of you may or may not know, has his contemplative prayer. And in that, there's this deep reflection of the divine. And in reflecting upon the divine in the third person, there's also that direct experience of the first person. And what we find within Christianity, as we do within all these faiths, is that all of these perspectives are readily available. Is that we have a first-person perspective, a second-person perspective, and a third-person perspective, or first face of God, second face of God, and third face of God, simply because these are all things that human beings do naturally. We naturally know how to take these perspectives. And one of the things we say from an integral point of view is that we can help make all the traditions more robust by pointing out the ways in which each of these faces are already there, and each of these faces can fully flourish. Because where, in my opinion, where we get into trouble is when we limit a tradition to only one face, and it particularly in a way that is both disempowering and in a way that can be institutionally abused. So if I speak just really, really generally and broadly, we sometimes have seen historically within the Christian faith that there was an intentional stamping out of the first person perspective or first face of God perspective. Yes. And that was perhaps done because a second-person orientation would allow certain people to remain in power. So it allowed, say, the Pope to remain in power, or allowed other particular people of spiritual authority to remain in power. Because if we allow everybody to recognize the fact that there is a first-person aspect of the divine, or that our very source and root of awareness is none other than the divine itself, then that's deeply empowering. and it actually decentralizes and democratizes this capacity for spiritual connection. And I think one of the best things we can do for humanity is to make available the fact that all three of these faces are readily available in all faiths and in no faith at all. One could be entirely secular. One could be entirely secular and have a three-face relationship. And maybe if I could just say a bit about that, because in my direct experience, this has been really powerful for me. And that's that we can have a second-person relationship to reality. And you don't have to believe in a God or be spiritual. But with reality, we can actually just constantly say thank you. We can, every day, we can wake up and in our experience with reality and with other people, we can express pure gratitude. And in that gratitude towards reality, we're beginning to build a direct relationship with reality itself. And that can be such a powerful practice. And one can be a scientist and an atheist and can still develop this sense of gratitude towards existence, towards reality in a deeply relational way. And that's wonderful and available to anybody. And in the same way, we don't have to believe in some sort of God in order to have a first-person relationship with reality. There are practices that we can do, just simple sitting quietly and examining certain ways in which our mind constructs reality, that we can begin to deconstruct our separation. That most of us are so embedded in our thoughts and in our personalities, and even in time and space and individuality, that we don't have this capacity to really feel the interconnectedness with everything in our direct experience. But someone who's, again, an atheist scientist could take a few minutes out of the day to simply feel that first-person connection with reality. And I would just say that that's available to anybody. That's wonderful. And then finally, the part that I think is most easily the entry point for the sort of atheist or secular person is this entry point of the third person, just understanding that everything is interconnected. We know that through both the ecology is telling us this, quantum physics is telling us this, string theory is telling us this. There's studies of how the neurons in the brain actually work to show the deep interconnection of them. So it's a great entry point in just understanding this incredible dynamic web of life that we're all a part of. So just to also bring in the secular atheists, because they're part of this conversation too. We're all part of reality and can all have these relationships of three faces of God, or we could just call it three faces of reality.
Thank you, because one of the many ways that's interesting is that it gives me more secular language to describe this. It's not that everybody's an atheist, it's that they're so skittish once they hear the word God. And so to just put it in terms of life or reality is a way to make these same points. Thank you very much. I'm stealing that.
Yeah, you're very, very welcome to. These things come through me and others, and they're sort of out in the field for everybody to use. So wonderful. And I really like, Ellen, what you just said about life, because reality has sort of an abstraction to it, but life has a deep connection to it. So the three faces of life, or three orientations to life, I really like that. So I'm stealing that. Perfect.
All right. You're welcome to it.
Well, I love the fact that we get all of this allows us to get away from the hang-ups people may have with certain vocabulary or certain words that have a lot of baggage associated with them. And it frees the process to be available for all of us to reach our deepest humanity and our deepest potential for ourselves and for the way we show up in the world and the way we relate to each other and the way we relate to ourselves. I mean, this may be the best 15 minutes I've ever spent in my life. I kid you not. And I love the way that you pulled it all together comfortably and in simple language. It's just, thank you so much. And we even have a few more minutes to explore this. And I'm hoping that...
Well, maybe I will say something else then, if you don't mind.
Well, wait. First, we're going to explore it after the break. We're up against another break. But then we'll have another segment to keep talking. So stay with us with Dustin DiPerna, and we'll be back with the Three Faces of God.
When you pray, do you wonder if anyone is listening? What should and can you ask of God? Why aren't your prayers being answered? prayer is a challenge for many of us. Now there's a new book that can help deepen your understanding. Based on his 35 years in ministry, author Jim Rosemergy has developed a prayer and meditation practice called The Gathering. In just 40 days, The Gathering will become your foundation for a genuine, ever-deepening experience of God's immanent presence and unlimited power. You'll understand that God can't fulfill your needs, but your needs can be met. You'll see that prayer isn't something you do, it's something you experience. Explore Jim Rosemergy's new book, The Gathering, a 40-day guide to the power of group and personal prayer. Available now at www.unitybooks.org.
Are you ready for the next steps on your spiritual path? If you are, you won't want to miss the Yoga Hour, Living the Eternal Way, with Reverend Ellen Grace O'Brien from the Center for Spiritual Enlightenment in San Jose, California. Essential insights and practices from the ancient yoga science of self-realization show us how to live healthier, happier, more balanced lives. The benefits of spiritually conscious living start now. For a time-tested method to live with purpose and realize your infinite potential, tune in to the Yoga Hour, Living the Eternal Way, with Reverend Ellen Grace O'Brien, every Thursday morning at 10 Central, 8 a.m. Pacific. Only on Unity FM, the voice of an awakening world. You are tuned in to the Three Faces of God. Here are your hosts, Karen Kelly and Ellen Davenport.
Hey, we are back with the Three Faces, continuing this fascinating conversation with our guest, Dustin DePerna, who is a Ken Wilber guy. So he knows about the Three Faces of God, but he's also studied all the world religions. He's exactly the person we wanted to come piece this all together for us, and that's what he's doing. So what's next?
Well, let's talk a little bit about how you can bring all these into your direct experience. And before we do that, I just have to say one other thing about Dustin. I've read quite a bit of Ken Wilber's stuff, and listened to him on YouTube and tried to gobble up as much of his stuff as what I appreciate even more so about you, Dustin, is that you can take all this stuff you've learned and all the ideas, and you can make them into very easy language that all of us can understand. And you can translate this stuff into comfortable ways of appreciating it. And man, this is just wonderful. So I want to get back to you, and you had mentioned that we can talk a little bit about bringing these three faces into our direct experience, and maybe you can talk a little bit when you're doing that about how that's happened for you.
Great. Yeah, happy to do that. Thank you. So I think starting with me may be an interesting place, and then we'll move into sort of seeing how everybody can bring this into their own experience. Because, from the very beginning, just talking about things, it's interesting for a little while. But unless we're bringing this directly into our experience, then we're just talking about it. So let's bring these things into our experience. And so I'll start with just my own practice and my own sense of how these things unfold. And when I first started working with the Three Faces of God, I was doing them as if I had to do them each separately, which was perfectly fine, in a certain way. So I had my meditation practice, sort of a quiet contemplative practice. And in that practice, I would just allow my mind to relax. And in allowing my mind to relax, I would feel a deeper sense of connectivity at the core of my awareness with everything around me. Mm-hmm. And there was a sense that in that deeper relaxation into an I amness, there was a sense that that very I amness is none other than everything that is around me, everything that I'm seeing, everything above me, below me, up, inside of me. And so that connection just gets stronger and stronger and stronger, but it takes practice. It takes a direct orientation towards that inward I amness for that sort of release of individuality to happen. But, at that time I was doing that practice, and then I would come out of the practice and I would then feel totally separate again. And then in feeling totally separate again, I would say, well, what's the proper orientation here? And I would say, a second face of God. If I'm, so what I began doing is, instead of just treating the divine as sort of this transcendent divine that I was in a sort of relationship or devotion to, I began pulling that divinity into each person that I met. And in doing that, it was like every time I met another human being or a tree or a dog or any other entity, there would be a sort of connection to recognizing that in this connection here, in this relationship, I'm relating to divinity. I'm relating to the divine. I'm relating to that deepest sense of I amness that's coming through this other person. So instead of it being sort of an abstract devotion, there was a direct experience of each time I'm with somebody or each time I'm speaking to somebody, I can actually have a direct relationship with the divine in that moment. And so there was a way in which it came very much into my direct experience and continues to be part of my direct experience. And then in third person, you guys have been speaking about it as a web of life, which I think is perfectly true. Another way that I think about it is that I love these massive conceptual maps of reality. And that's just maybe my own pathology. But it's helped to make so much sense about the world. So anytime that I'm taking a third-person perspective on reality, I'm making reality an object, and I'm studying it, I'm mapping it, and I'm analyzing it, that's a spiritual practice for me. I'm actually mapping, I'm drawing a map of the divine through concepts, through ideas, through language. Writing a book for me is such a third-person practice. I'm articulating divinity onto pages as I write, and as a form of abstraction or third-person connectivity. And so each of these things originally were separate in my life. There was a first-person practice, there was a second-person practice, and there was a third-person practice done at separate times, at separate places, in separate circumstances. What's begun to happen now in my life is that the three faces are starting to blend together, and that the separation of distinct time periods of practice is starting to fade. And what's beginning to happen now is that first-person sense of I amness infusing everything, infusing the whole of reality, is beginning to happen all of the time in my life. But what's so cool about that is that doesn't negate the fact that the other faces are still there. So even as I'm feeling totally connected and embedded into the whole of reality, I can still take this amazing relational perspective to every single person I meet, recognizing them both as an expression of this deeper I amness, but also as divinity showing up here. And there's a chance to express total gratitude to divinity right here and now as I meet the two of you or any other person. And that doesn't mean it needs to be a separate time period. It's happening all at the same time. Same thing with the third-person contemplation, that you can hold that connectivity of relationship or devotion and awareness being the whole of reality and do these third-person abstractions or understand the interconnectivity of the web of life or contemplation or write books. And so what I find eventually is that at the beginning of practice, it's important to know the difference between these faces, first, second, and third. It's really important because oftentimes we're only doing one and not the other two. And then eventually, after we practice each of them, first, second, and third face separately, eventually they begin to blend into our life. And the richness and robustness that comes from a life that's living fully with these three faces of God online all of the time, it can't be compared to anything else. It really is the divine life. And it's possible for any and all of us just with some practice and paying attention to how these three faces are showing up in our own life. So I hope that's helpful, because certainly in my life it has been so incredible to be engaging these faces of God and how to have them inform moment to moment how reality is experienced. Just incredible.
This is very powerful. And what crossed my mind when you were talking is in Unity we talk a lot about our co-creation with God, that we are co-creators in the world and are the feet and the face of God in the world. And when you were talking about articulating through writing in the third phase, that really was a co-creative exercise, it sort of brought it all around to me, kind of pulled it all together, that we as co-creators, we think of as coming from the first phase, that we are co-creating with God. But you really gave a good illustration of how it's all merged together. I'm co-creating, but the result of what I'm creating and articulating is a third phase, because I'm talking about and I'm demonstrating for, but I'm also creating from and sharing with. Does that make sense? I mean, is that an accurate observation?
Yeah, Karen, absolutely. And I think you use these really nice words. So from a first person, we're creating from a second person, we're creating with, and from a third person, we're creating for. I think that's beautiful. I really think that's a great way to say it. So I'm
You're going to steal that. You're going to steal that. No, I think it's phenomenal, and just thank you for sharing that. So you can give us some tips, maybe, in these last couple of minutes.
I can. Well, I can start by saying, so this is mostly a Unity audience, I'm assuming, and what I'd maybe recommend is that groups of people within congregations potentially start getting together to practice. So instead of communities of contemplation, and I'm sure there's many communities of discussion and contemplation, but real communities of practice. And, another one of the projects that I'm involved in, we've developed a whole practice book that helps communities to engage with each other in bringing some of these things forth. So, for example, we have one practice that we do together where we get groups together and we actually practice the three faces of God, where we have specific instructions about how to rest more deeply into the first face of God. We have other practices where we come together and actually practice this devotional or I-thou relationship with God as it's showing up right now in another human being. And we have other practices where we're contemplating about the divine and or about God or about reality, how it's showing up in some other form. And so my suggestion or my tips would be that congregations all over the Unity community get together and form communities of practice. And in doing that, they begin to bring these into their direct experience. And if that's things people are interested in, they can definitely get in touch, and we can help guide them through that process. But there's nothing like direct experience, and nothing ever comes in the way of that. So I highly encourage that.
This is a formal request to get that to touch base and get that information, so that we can explore it a little further. Maybe take a look at the workbook you're referring to.
Sure, happy to share.
Wow, I'm loving this. Ellen, do you want to? I could babble for 2 minutes more.
Do you see that same kind of synthesis of the three faces going on at the macro level in the world's religions? Are we becoming more aware of what's available to us?
Well, here's what's really interesting. Thanks for asking the question, Ellen. Sometimes we speak about the spiral, and I'm not sure if people in Unity will be familiar with sort of these spirals or these levels of development. But
lots of them are.
Yeah, the basic idea is that we gain capacity for perspective taking as we increase in development, in our developmental intelligence across different lines of development. And in increasing capacity to take perspectives, what we find is that at less developed levels, I know that you said a lot of your community won't like the idea of less and more, but we'll use it because there's a lot of good research that says there are things that we can track that show less and more. And that's simply in terms of perspective taking. But what we find is that at these early stages of perspective taking, we tend to be limited to one perspective, or we tend to be limited to a very one portion of the face of God. So we might latch onto the second face of God and deny the existence of third face of God or first face of God. As we increase in development, as we increase in our capacity to take perspectives, we gain more fluidity, or we gain more capacity to actually shift perspectives depending on different contexts. So you might find in your communities that some people are saying, oh, wow, well, these three faces are very interesting. And I notice how I'm taking these perspectives all the time in my life. Sometimes I'm taking a first person. Sometimes I'm taking a second person. Sometimes I'm taking a third person or a third face of God. And that's really great because what people are tracking there is their own development in their capacity to take perspectives. And then I think what you'll find eventually in folks as they continue to develop is this merging that we were just talking about, is this capacity to actually almost begin to simultaneously take multiple perspectives all at once without needing to take one and then the next and then the next. So to answer your question about the broader, what I'm seeing broader, yes, I think that these three perspectives are becoming more prevalent, but it's precisely because on whole, there's a general evolution on our planet that's happening in people's development where people are gaining the capacity to stably take more perspectives in a more natural way. And I see these three faces of God as a perfect way to actually increase perspective taking within the traditions themselves. If we can take a fundamentalist and we can say, hey, second face of God, absolutely, you are right. That is a very, very critical perspective. And watch this. You also could take a first-person perspective or a third-person perspective. And that slight shift out of a single perspective and that tunnel vision really liberates capacity for perspective taking, which liberates capacity for vertical development, which is what we want across the planet. So Three Faces of God is really a secret Trojan horse of developmental capacity and perspective taking, which is fantastic. Everybody wins when we gain more perspective.
I just so hate that we are out of time. We could talk another hour or two. Dustin, you've been the perfect wrap to this whole 6-week series. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for finding me. This is just wonderful.
Do you know what? This has actually been the perfect hour that has brought all my searching and all my studies and all my inquiry and questions to a head in the best way. And I'm well, thank you. Thank you. I'm ready for my next stage. I'm ready for my next level. It's all come to play, and I'm so grateful. And
have a wonderful summer in Switzerland with the world's most spiritually intelligent people. I love that idea.
And I want to just thank both of you. The work that you're doing in the world is so important. And the work that you're doing for unity and bringing these sort of ideas out. I want to just send you infinite blessings and positivities for your work and for everything that you're doing. Thank you.
Blessings to you. Namaste, my friend. Safe
Bye,
travels.
You guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Three Faces of God with Karen Kelly and Reverend Ellen Davenport. This is a 6-week special series about understanding the divine in different ways. This program is brought to you in part by EllenDavenport.com and by Unity of Wimberley, Texas, online at unityofwimberley.com.
Are you tired of life slamming the door in your face? Did you get another rejection letter, pink slip, foreclosure notice, or go on yet another bad date? Does it seem like the older you get, the more hopeless life seems? Are you ready to stop taking no as your final answer? Then join us for Design Your Life, a talk show by Kevin Cottrell Ross, the coach's coach. Go into the locker room for 1 full hour with the championship coach every week and start designing your winning playbook that will make the rest of your life the best of your life. That's Design Your Life with Kevin Cottrell Ross, the coach's coach, Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Central Time on Unity Online Radio, the voice of an awakening world.
In quiet moments of prayer, let go of any concern. Anchor your trust deep in the realization that with God all things are possible. Never doubt it for a single moment.
This meditative moment is brought to you by Unity.
Do you think you know all you want to know about the characters in the Bible? Do you know who could be called the king who loved too much? Or what it means to be a Jezebel? Or that the best love story in the Bible begins with a declared commitment of 2 women? The Bible's symbolic meaning can help you transform your life and discover the presence and power of God within you. Find out what these characters can teach you about your own life today by tuning into Biblical Power for Your Life. Each week, co-hosts Reverends Karen Tudor and E.J. Niles present a Bible character from a historical, cultural, psychological, and symbolic perspective. Your comments and questions are part of this lively discussion. Tune in every Thursday at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, and power up your life only at Unity Online Radio, the voice of an awakening world.